So this is slightly different than anything that I've done so far in the area of conceptual engineering, and there's lots that I could say about that. And what was going to be a very short, sharp paper turned into an absolute behemoth with lots of bells and whistles. And I've tried to distill it for the sake of the talk today into sort of like the key message that I want to get across. Of course, that runs the risk of ending up quite superficial, but hopefully that'll be okay. There's also some really interesting overlaps with some of the other things that are being presented here in a way that I wouldn't have expected before I saw the program necessarily. And so that's really interesting. And I'm going to have to go away and rethink a few things maybe in light of both Paul's talk and maybe David's yesterday, perhaps some others too. Anyway, here's the starting point. The starting point is just I'm sat here in my chair trying to think. Okay, so if I was looking for inspiration, right? So on strategies for the kind of implementation-y bits of conceptual engineering, for the kind of attempting to propagate ameliorated concepts, trying to promote uptake. Like, where would I look for inspiration for hypotheses? Obviously, given the kind of person I am, I'm not going to try and do all of that completely from the armchair. At some point, I'm going to want to sort of try and get some data on how plausible some of, on whether these hypotheses end up kind of being borne out. But like, where am I going to turn to for some hypotheses? And it just strikes me that the kind of natural place to turn to, in a way, is normative ethics, because for millennia, philosophers in normative ethics have been thinking about an analogous implementation problem, and that is, we've got this way of life. There are better ways of life we could have. Like, how do we get ourselves there? There's a kind of very straightforward kind of implementation problem which people have thought about within normative ethics since forever, as undergrads like to put it, since time immemorial. And so, like, there's a really people have thought about a problem with an analogous shape. As people interested in implementation in conceptual engineering, we should just go and look what people have had to say over there. And that's a kind of just the basic thought. I could probably stop the talk there in a way, but what I'm going to do for the rest of the talk is just try and substantiate that with an illustration. Just have a look at some of the ideas that are out there in normative ethics about how to support the process of moral development, how to support the transition from kind of where we are now, broadly speaking, behaviorally, and where we would like to be, where we should be, and to just see what happens if you were to take those ideas from ethics and sort of run with them within conceptual engineering. Hopefully that's relatively clear as the shape of a project. I don't want to spend too much time on giving you the shape of the project. So when I think of ideas that are out there in normative ethics about how to support moral development, what do I think of? Well, I think of things like a process of habituation, right? The moral learner, maybe key to moral development is they're going through a process of habituation, where that's something like modeling yourself on a model person, like do what a virtuous person would do, for example. Do what they would do often enough such that you develop a habit. And of course, like the full story within things like virtue ethics as to how habituation is supposed to support moral development. Lots of different takes on that, lots of various complexities, but many people in normative ethics think like central to the process of moral development is going to be this process of habituation, emulating the behavior of some model individual enough that you make a habit that you behave in such ways. I also think of things like recommendations that the environment of the learner is very carefully curated or cultivated in order to promote their opportunities for moral development. So this is perhaps one of the places where this is most emphasized is in sort of early Confucian ethics, where there's this kind of idea that you support the development of character by sort of really quite extensive, what gets translated as rituals, sort of social protocols for situations and for roles, which kind of dictate how one behaves, what one wears, what forms of address one uses, all kinds of sort of very strict social protocols. But the idea, the general idea that we need to be very careful in cultivating the environment of the moral learner is much more widespread than that. Why? What are you attempting to achieve there? Well, the idea within kind of contemporary discussions of Confucian ethics seems to be like the way of kind of parsing what's going on there is that part of what you're doing is limiting unwanted influence upon the learner in order to kind of help it be the case that the behavior is flowing from character, flowing from stable dispositional traits, and thereby kind of reinforcing the disposition to behave in the kind of desired ways. Good. And other things might fit into other kinds of situational control, might sort of fit into that sort of broad theme as well. What else do I think of? Well, the various people, like in various different traditions in normative ethics, emphasize that the moral learner goes through a process of deliberate practice, right? Some kind of moral apprenticeship where they practice what to do in particular situations in perhaps a fairly artificial way. They're not merely kind of in the process of their everyday lives doing what the virtuous person would do. There's going to be sort of an explicit and deliberate process of practice, like doing your piano practice, right? Practicing your arpeggios. I put it on the handout. So that's something that some care ethicists emphasize, but it's also part of what some people think of as an Aristotelian process of habituation, kind of more fleshed out, more a kind of richer understanding than I kind of gave in that little bullet point. What else do I kind of think of? Well, again, from some sort of areas of care ethics, there's an idea that what the approach to moral development really should be, in some sense, practice first, right? So we're in the context of the relevant corners of care ethics. The thought is, look, we practice care in our lives. We perform care as a practice, and the story about moral development is going to start with those practices, right? It's going to start with care as a practice. It's going to involve throwing yourself into the concrete, arbitrary, partial, problem-laden relations in which you kind of find yourself in, the very sort of contingent state of affairs in which you find yourself practicing care. And the process of moral development is going to be working on developing and improving those practices. So there's kind of a practice-first approach to moral development, where you're focusing not on sort of directly reinforcing some behavioral dispositions of an individual, but the emphasis upon the extant practices and developing and improving them. And then there's kind of ideas like a sort of a community first approach to moral development, which I'm kind of most familiar with because I've been thinking about African communitarianism in the context of environmental philosophy recently. But there's various kind of communitarian approaches to ethics out there. And the kind of model there is that our understanding of moral development is such that it's not something like becoming a moral person, even, is not something that can be done without by an individual in isolation. It requires community, it requires being part of a community, it requires relating to others communally. The thought is that moral learners, moral developers need to be embedded in a community in which there's kind of mutual support of development via things like feedback and engaging others in kind of moral disputation in sort of concrete social situations within their lives, within the communities they find themselves in. And that requires a certain kind of community to kind of exist, right? There needs to be, if you're going to accept others engaging you in moral disputation, if you're going to accept kind of strangers giving your child moral instruction, then there needs to be some kind of general sense of belonging to a communal we, to a community. One needs to kind of identify with the group in some sense, and there's got to be a certain element of perhaps investment in collective endeavors. But in any case, there's kind of this approach that's out there to moral development that says, look, we really need to be thinking about the community level first. All right. So I mean, those are just the ideas that occur to me. So if you're looking to normative ethics for ideas about like how you support the process of moral development, those are the ideas that sort of crop up to me. It's not supposed to be a those are the best ideas. It's not supposed to be a those are compatible ideas. Even just here are some ideas from normative ethics. So the next thing to do is to ask, okay, so what kinds of approaches to implementation in conceptual engineering are suggested, might be suggested by, like if we were to borrow those kind of ideas and run with them within the domain of conceptual engineering. And I guess the basic idea should be fairly clear, right? The target population in some way of users is perhaps going to go through a process of habituation, right? Actively modeling their behavior or model agents, perhaps in a kind of supported environment with mentors and so on. Perhaps like their development is going to be supported with kind of careful manipulations and careful structure and careful cultivation of their environment, perhaps via things like, I don't know, it could include lots of things. It could involve nudge or choice editing, but it could also involve the kinds of social protocols which are at play in kind of the early Confucian approaches to these things. It might involve the target population kind of actively practicing new concepts, and it might involve them sort of throwing themselves into the current imperfect conceptual practices in which they find themselves. What I have in mind there is like a population who you're trying to get to adopt sort of a new set of gender terms, for example. Maybe key to the process of moral development is going to be to get them to throw themselves into the process of talking about gender in their lives, right? Using gender terms, talking about gender with the people around them, even in imperfect ways, and to work on improving those practices rather than kind of trying to wipe the slate clean and like get them to start using new gender concepts right from the off. Like the kind of practice first might be, and it would be, you wouldn't want to take an approach, like if you were kind of going by this kind of practice first route, you wouldn't want to take an approach which would initially discourage the target population from engaging in gender talk, for example. And like on the community first kind of approach, you'd want the target population to be part of a kind of supporting community of the right kind, whereby they could do this kind of mutually supporting sort of thing. So that's the basic idea. Of course, that's not yet a strategy to implementation within a domain of conceptual engineering, but it does, like, if you were to take those ideas and run with it, there are some clear, more concrete strategies that would be suggested. So as a conceptual engineer or as a researcher kind of working in this conceptual engineering area, what sort of concrete strategies might you be kind of wanting to adopt here? Well, maybe you'd want to be doing things like ensuring that there are visible role models exhibiting the desirable linguistic conceptual behaviors. Right? It might involve active curation of some visible role models that people could use to model their behavior on in order to go through a process of habituation. Right? If you're hoping the target population will go through a process of habituation, they need to have role models, and part of what the conceptual engineer could do might be to provide those. Or if you're kind of employing kind of structured sort of social protocols to kind of help that process along. I should say something a bit about what I mean by social protocols in that sort of instance. I have in mind things like, last summer, you had people doing kind of really bizarre things like stepping off pavements in order to kind of really conspicuously go around you in a particular way in quite a kind of ritualized fashion. Right, there's various kind of roles that you might take that as playing, but one thing that's doing is kind of perhaps supporting the development and take the uptake of the concept of social distancing, right? It might also be promoting the relevant behaviors, but one thing that's clear is that like that behavior doesn't flow directly from the concept of social distancing, right? It's kind of like additional content. It's kind of like artificial. It's like just this artificial social protocol that people are following in order to support some kind of transition in society, whether that's conceptual or not. But that's the kind of thing I have in mind. Similarly, you might think of things like announcing pronouns at the beginning of talks or at the beginning of conferences, kind of conspicuous announcing of pronouns. It sort of facilitates a certain kind of social transition. Does it directly follow from, like, we should just use the pronouns that people want us to use? Like, does it follow from that rule? Well, no, not obviously, right? It's kind of like an additional social protocol that's kind of being deployed in order to support certain transitions in usage, perhaps. Like exactly how you think about any given example is like up for grabs a little bit, but that's the kind of thing that I have in mind when I'm talking about social protocols when it comes to sort of linguistic conceptual things. Like you want individuals to go through a process of like deliberate practice, right? Well, you need to give them opportunities to practice. You need to provide them with sources of feedback. What might that look like? I mean, God knows, but maybe things like the Duolingo model of conceptual engineering should be taken seriously, right? Maybe some form of gamification. But like the strategy which the conceptual engineer needs to kind of go down if they were taking this kind of route that took a practice approach to moral development seriously, well, they'd need to provide people with opportunities for practice. They'd need to provide people with the support they needed to go through that. And I don't know, maybe something like the Duolingo model would be a way forward. And one thing that's worth noting is that the conceptual engineer isn't obviously operating from scratch. So like it's going to make sense for them to try to exploit existing structures that are out there, where those are kind of existing hierarchies of role models that could be used, people that exist within a hierarchy of role models already, that are kind of influencers in some sense, and to turn them into the kinds of influencers that are needed for this process of habituation to kind of get going. The conceptual engineer can exploit existing kind of community structures where there might already be a pre-existing sense of community wherein a system of mutual support for conceptual development could exist. And existing systems of training and feedback. So whether our existing educational processes or professional development courses, or whether kind of just existing systems of training and feedback, then I guess the conceptual engineer should be prepared to exploit those, perhaps. So they don't have to be working completely from scratch. So like those are the kinds of things that the conceptual engineer would want to be doing if they were going to take these ideas from normative ethics and run with them. Now, like those as strategies raise some obvious challenges. I'm not kind of presenting this as like a full, complete package of things that the conceptual engineer could do. By the way, just sort of it's a list of it's a disjunctive list, but you could obviously combine them. But those kinds of strategies kind of raise certain kinds of challenges. Like you're not just asking a population to kind of adopt a new concept, right? All kind of conceptual engineering that takes that kind of form already has some worries about paternalism, or some worries about sort of those top-down dynamics kind of raise concerns. But like you're asking people to kind of go through a process of habituation in their lives, to model their behavior on some people that potentially you're providing them with. You're asking them to go through a process of deliberate practice to kind of do their daily Duolingo conceptual practice, right? You're asking quite a lot of individuals in the target population who, in many cases, many areas that you might be interested in conceptual engineering, don't have a prior investment in conceptual development in this area. And so they're kind of real. If you're going to get them to do that, you're going to have to coerce them to do that. You're going to have to provide them with the relevant incentives. And like, okay, worries about whether that's tenable, like whether you could even do that, or whether like that's a morally problematic thing to be doing, kind of immediately raise their heads. There are also kind of other concerns about some of these dynamics, for example, relying upon influencers or role models or existing social structures to kind of propagate things. And that's worries like things like equivalents to social media bubbles or something, kind of conceptual bubbles. Like how do you how do you negotiate that as a conceptual engineer? The fact that you, by relying upon particular role models, you might end up with populations of users that are kind of bubbled and isolated from the wider community that you might want to influence in turn. There's kind of existing discussions out there about things like sponsored content and influencers and the extent to which there's resistance around such mechanisms, so it might not be even tenable to exploit them, but also worries about transparency and that sort of thing around those kinds of top-down attempts to exert influence. And there's lots of other kind of worries that I could draw attention to too. There are kind of interesting dynamics in relation to social kind of power and influence. So where you're trying to get people to do these things via a system of coercive measures or by the provision of incentives, well then people who are kind of better off in society, who have more power, have got greater power to resist doing those things, to kind of the incentives are going to be less effective for the more powerful. Yes, I've got a big long list, and I'm not going to bore you. There's a bigger list in the big long paper. I try and keep things fairly brief. What I think is really interesting, like once you start to kind of think these things through, once you start to think, okay, so what kinds of challenges are going to come up when you think about the strategies that are suggested by taking these ideas from normative ethics and running with them within the domain of conceptual engineering, is that they kind of really point towards, like, if those are the challenges that are coming up, well, then there are certain things that you could do methodologically. There's certain kind of very natural methodological choices you could make that would kind of guard against some of those concerns that would prevent you getting into the kind of situations that we're worrying about there. And interestingly, they're very similar to what some other people have been talking about at this workshop so far. Right. So there are various kind of extant models of research from elsewhere in the academy, which are kind of, some of their key selling points are negotiating concerns such as these, right? So something like a more participatory model of research where key stakeholders are kind of engaged, not just in the process of implementation, but throughout the process of conceptual engineering. That's something that the paper that Manuel talked about, the fully experimental conceptual engineering paper, the kind of model of conceptual engineering presented in there is also kind of geared around very heavy involvement of stakeholders throughout the process, but in a slightly different context. Like there are existing models of research in which, like, you would be engaging with and ensuring kind of participation of the target population, the population of interest throughout the research process. And one of the key selling points of more participatory models of research is to kind of negotiate concerns about autonomy and undue influence, and about kind of otherwise concerning top-down dynamics and paternalism and these kind of things, and avoiding the risk of kind of distortion of your kind of strategies not having the effect that you expect them to have, because you don't fully understand what their impact is going to be on the ground, right? If you want to design incentive, if you want to design interventions that are going to have the effect that you want them to have, then a kind of more participatory model of research can be effective, because it helps you understand like how those interventions are going to play out once you introduce them into the community. If you're interested in kind of like a community first kind of approach, well, then there are researchers out there in various places in the academy who's like, there's an acronym, CB, what would it be? CBPR, community-based participatory research, right? Which does a similar kind of thing, but really takes place at a community level, and kind of the research process uses a kind of community level organization to kind of organize the research activities and within which the research activities take place. And recent kind of approaches to that have even sort of suggested that to ensure kind of longevity, to ensure that kind of fairly low level community-based projects can have a kind of long-lasting effect and a wider effect. Right, there are approaches to community-based participatory research that encourage kind of incorporating within that research methodology elements of kind of social movement building, as Tremblay et al. Put it, to kind of to help with the scaling up from community-based kind of projects to something a bit wider. And there's a nice little table as to what exactly a social movement building might look like that Tremblay et al. Take from these guys. But there are other but there are other kind of approaches out there in the kind of academy that kind of look at these kind of community-based or participatory level sort of aspects to research methodology. So another thing that another approach that looks relevant perhaps for the conceptual engineer is what's the best way to put this? So if your concerns about community-based kind of research methodologies is one of scale and one about potentially limited influence, that's something which is struggled with in various areas of the academy, in particular in relation to kind of environmental behavior change, in terms of kind of introducing interventions to reduce carbon footprints. Community level projects can be very effective in kind of encouraging change, but of course community-based projects have very small impact because they involve a very small number of people, and the amount of change that you need is kind of much more widespread in society. That's a kind of problem that's kind of been struggled with. And so when thinking about environmental messaging and on the design of environmental messaging within kind of academic research on the topic, one approach that's kind of been considered is an approach to environmental messaging that aims to kind of foment community level. Sorry, I'm being attacked by clothes moths. That tries to encourage kind of community level activity, right? But maybe not with that active involvement of the researcher, and where the community level projects that are kind of encouraged by the environmental messaging are not geared around lowering their particular those individuals' carbon footprints, but are geared around demanding top-level regulation in order to facilitate wider behavior change. And so the thought is like that there are these kind of methodologies out there and suggestions about how academics can proceed when it comes to issues of facilitating behavior change and facilitating effective messaging to promote behavior change, which conceptual engineers can kind of borrow from. So there we are. I mean, that's what I have to say, really. I will wrap up. I don't know exactly how long I've been talking for. I forgot to take note. But what I will say is that, like, one thing that I think is kind of quite interesting here is that one way that I kind of see what I'm doing in this paper is as providing a very kind of clearly philosophical route to some strategies for conceptual engineering, for a methodological kind of broadening of the strategies for implementation within conceptual engineering via this kind of analogy with ethics, which kind of which others have made for different reasons, but maybe there's a value to having a clearly philosophical motivation, or some kind of clearly philosophical route to those kind of to that methodological broadening. Maybe there's some kind of value for that. But the basic message is that if you're looking for ideas about how to approach implementation in conceptual engineering, ethicists have been thinking about an analogous issue of implementation Like that's a big part of what ethics is and has been since forever. And so if we're looking for hypotheses as to what could work and what approaches might be worth exploring within conceptual engineering, maybe it's worth borrowing some ideas from normative ethics. And that's me, I guess. I could say other things, but I won't.